April 18th, 1942. 500 miles off the coast of Japan. Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle stood on the pitching deck of the USS Hornet, rain streaming down his leather jacket as he watched waves crash over the carrier's bow. Behind him, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers sat lashed to the flight deck. Aircraft never designed for carrier operations, loaded beyond their safe limits, preparing for a mission that aviation engineers had declared impossible. In less than 3 hours, these machines would violate Japanese airspace for the first time since Pearl Harbor, and the man who figured out how to make it happen wasn't just a pilot. He was the engineer who had rewritten the laws of what bombers could do. What most people don't know about the Doolittle Raid is that it wasn't just about courage or surprise. It was about engineering genius. How one man took a medium bomber designed for comfortable runways and transformed it into a stripped-down, fuel-guzzling, ship-launched weapon that could reach a target 1,600 miles away and somehow make it back to friendly territory. The modifications Doolittle engineered turned the B-25 from a standard Army Air Forces bomber into something the Japanese never saw coming. A precision strike weapon that could launch from the ocean itself. The story begins 3 months earlier, in January 1942, when America was reeling from disaster after disaster. The Pacific Fleet lay in ruins at Pearl Harbor. The Philippines were falling. Wake Island had surrendered. Singapore would soon collapse. Japanese forces seemed unstoppable, and American morale had plummeted to depths not seen since the darkest days of the Revolution. President Roosevelt needed a victory, any victory, that could prove to America and the world that Japan itself was vulnerable. Captain Francis Lowe, a submarine officer on Admiral Ernest King's staff, had an idea that seemed insane. Launch Army bombers from a Navy carrier, strike Japan, then fly on to land in China. The concept violated everything the military knew about carrier operations. Carriers launched fighters and dive bombers, light aircraft designed for short takeoffs and arrested landings. Army bombers were heavy, land-based machines requiring long concrete runways. The two worlds simply didn't mix. But Admiral King saw the strategic brilliance in the madness and called in the one man who might make it work, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle. At 45 years old, Doolittle was already a legend in American aviation. He held a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT. He'd won the first Schneider Trophy race in 1925, setting a seaplane speed record. In 1932, he'd set the transcontinental speed record, racing coast to coast in under 12 hours. He'd pioneered instrument flying, performing the first flight conducted entirely on instruments with no outside visual reference. He'd developed high-octane aviation fuel that revolutionized aircraft performance. He'd worked as a test pilot for Shell Oil, pushing experimental fuels and engines to their absolute limits. If anyone could figure out how to launch a medium bomber from a carrier deck, it was Doolittle. But even he knew the challenge was extreme. The North American B-25 Mitchell was an excellent medium bomber by 1942 standards. Powered by 2 Wright R-2600 radial engines producing 1,400 horsepower each, it could carry 3,000 pounds of bombs at speeds up to 300 miles per hour. Its normal takeoff run required 1,200 feet of runway. The USS Hornet's flight deck provided only 467 feet from the starting position to the bow, and that was with the carrier steaming at full speed into a headwind. The mathematics were brutal. Standard B-25s loaded with fuel and bombs required nearly 3 times the available distance. Something had to change, and it had to change fast. Roosevelt wanted the mission launched by mid-April, giving Doolittle less than 3 months to solve problems that aviation engineers had never even attempted. Doolittle assembled a team at Eglin Field in Florida and began systematic testing. The first step was weight reduction. Strip every unnecessary pound from the aircraft to improve takeoff performance. This wasn't about minor adjustments. This was surgical removal of equipment. The ventral gun turret came out, saving 250 pounds. The liaison radio set was removed, another 50 pounds. The heavy navigator's drift meter was yanked, along with the bombardier's specialized equipment. Even the co-pilot's seat cushion was removed to save a few ounces. Every piece of equipment that didn't directly contribute to flying the aircraft or delivering bombs was eliminated. But weight reduction alone wouldn't solve the problem. Doolittle needed more fuel capacity, much more. The B-25's standard fuel load of 650 gallons provided a combat radius of about 750 miles. The mission profile required reaching Japan from 500 miles out, striking targets, then flying another 1,200 miles to airfields in China. The total distance exceeded 1,600 miles, and that was assuming everything went perfectly. Doolittle's solution was radical. Install additional fuel tanks everywhere possible inside the aircraft. A 225-gallon collapsible rubber bladder went into the top of the bomb bay. Another 160-gallon tank was installed in the lower bomb bay. A 60-gallon tank fit in the crawlway above the bomb bay. 10 5-gallon cans were secured in the rear fuselage, ready to be hand-pumped into the main tanks during flight. The total fuel capacity increased to 1,141 gallons, nearly double the standard load. The cost was significant. With full fuel and bomb load, the modified B-25s weighed over 31,000 pounds at takeoff, well above their normal maximum gross weight of 27,000 pounds. The extra weight meant the aircraft would be operating beyond their designed structural limits during takeoff and initial climb. It also meant longer takeoff runs, higher stall speeds, and reduced maneuverability, all potentially fatal in carrier operations. Doolittle conducted test after test at Eglin Field, measuring takeoff distances at various weights and wind speeds. He discovered that with a 30-knot headwind, achievable by steaming the carrier at full speed, the modified B-25s could become airborne in approximately 450 feet if the pilots used maximum power and held the brakes until the engines reached full throttle. But technique mattered as much as engineering. Doolittle developed a specific takeoff procedure that would be drilled into every pilot until it became instinctive. Hold the brakes while running engines up to full power. Watch the deck officer's signal flag. Release brakes on the flag drop. Hold the nose wheel on the deck while accelerating. Rotate at precisely the right moment. Too early, and the aircraft would mush into the ocean. Too late, and there wouldn't be enough deck remaining. The margin for error was measured in feet and seconds. There would be no second chances. If a pilot hesitated, misjudged the rotation, or failed to achieve full power, the 20-ton bomber would roll off the carrier's bow and plunge into the Pacific. Weaponry required modification as well. The mission called for striking military and industrial targets in Japan, which meant precision bombing from low altitude to ensure accuracy. Doolittle worked with ordnance specialists to develop a specific bomb load. 4 500-pound bombs per aircraft, a mix of high-explosive demolition bombs and incendiaries. But Japanese cities presented a unique challenge. Unlike European cities built primarily of stone and concrete, Japanese urban areas consisted largely of wood frame construction with paper walls, structures that would burn intensely if ignited. Doolittle understood that incendiary weapons could inflict devastating damage on such targets. The solution was to modify standard 500-pound general-purpose bombs by adding incendiary clusters, bundles of smaller thermite and magnesium bombs that would scatter on impact and start multiple fires simultaneously. The high-explosive bombs would blast structures apart, while the incendiaries would ignite the debris. The combination was designed to overwhelm Japanese firefighting capabilities. Navigation presented another engineering challenge. Flying 1,600 miles over open ocean, then navigating to specific targets in Japan, required precision that standard navigation equipment might not provide. Doolittle insisted on installing improved compass systems and adding a simple but effective bombing sight that could be operated by the pilot himself, eliminating the need for a dedicated bombardier. Lieutenant Henry Miller, a Navy navigator assigned to the project, worked with Doolittle to develop detailed navigation charts and flight plans. Every crew would have multiple checkpoints, compass headings, and alternate routes memorized. If they were separated or encountered unexpected weather, each aircraft had to be capable of independent navigation to both Japanese targets and Chinese landing fields. Defensive armament was reduced but not eliminated. The top turret with twin 50-caliber machine guns remained. It would be needed to fend off Japanese fighters after the attack. The tail guns stayed, providing rear defense during the escape, but the ventral turret's removal left the aircraft vulnerable from below, a calculated risk Doolittle accepted in exchange for weight savings. By March 1942, the modified B-25s were ready, and Doolittle began selecting and training crews. He needed volunteers, men willing to undertake a mission so dangerous that its full details couldn't be revealed until they were already at sea. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of experienced bomber pilots and crew members stepped forward. Doolittle selected 24 crews and began intensive training at Eglin Field. The training regimen was brutal. Repeated short-field takeoffs, low-altitude navigation exercises, simulated bombing runs at 50 feet above the ground, and endless practice with the modified fuel systems. Crews learned to hand-pump fuel from the auxiliary cans, manage fuel distribution to maintain proper weight balance, and operate on instruments for extended periods over water. The most critical training involved carrier takeoffs. None of these Army pilots had ever operated from a carrier, and there was no way to practice actual carrier launches without compromising mission security. Instead, Doolittle had white lines painted on Eglin's runway at 467 feet apart, the exact length available on the Hornet's deck. Pilots practiced taking off between those lines until they could do it consistently, even in crosswinds. Lieutenant Richard Cole, who would serve as Doolittle's co-pilot on the mission, later recalled the training intensity. "We practiced those short takeoffs until we could do them in our sleep. Colonel Doolittle was absolutely meticulous. He wanted every pilot to be able to get that bomber off the ground in the minimum distance possible every single time. There was no margin for error, and he made sure we understood that." On March 1st, 16 B-25Bs were selected for the mission and underwent final modifications at the Mid-Continent Airlines facility in Minneapolis. These aircraft received the full package: extra fuel tanks, stripped equipment, modified bomb racks, improved navigation instruments, and a final weight reduction sweep that removed every non-essential item. One modification added, rather than removed: wooden broomstick handles were painted black and installed in the tail to look like additional gun barrels. These fake guns wouldn't fool Japanese fighters up close, but from a distance they might make attacking pilots more cautious. Every psychological advantage mattered. The aircraft were then flown to Alameda Naval Air Station in California, where they were hoisted aboard the USS Hornet on April 1st, 1942. 16 bombers lined the carrier's flight deck, their wingtips barely clearing the island superstructure. They would remain on deck for the entire voyage. too large to fit in the hangar bay, exposed to salt spray and weather. The Hornet sailed on April 2nd, accompanied by the USS Enterprise and a screen of cruisers and destroyers. The carrier task force, commanded by Admiral William Halsey, steamed west toward Japan under strict radio silence. The crews were finally briefed on their actual target. They would strike Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya, Japan's industrial heartland. The plan called for launching 400 miles from Japan after sunset on April 18th, allowing the bombers to strike their targets at dawn on the 19th and continue to China in daylight. But plans rarely survive contact with the enemy. On the morning of April 18th, still 700 miles from Japan, the task force encountered Japanese picket boats, small patrol vessels stationed far offshore to provide early warning of approaching threats. The picket boat Nito Maru spotted the American carriers and immediately radioed Tokyo before being destroyed by gunfire from the USS Nashville. Doolittle and Admiral Halsey faced an immediate decision. The Japanese now knew American carriers were approaching. Fighter aircraft and warships would be scrambled to intercept. The element of surprise was compromised. They had two options: abort the mission and retreat, or launch immediately despite being 200 miles farther from Japan than planned. Doolittle didn't hesitate. "We're going." The launch distance had just increased from 500 miles to 700 miles. The fuel calculations that had been worked out so carefully were now meaningless. The bombers would be flying at the absolute edge of their range, with zero margin for error. Reaching the designated Chinese airfields would be nearly impossible, but turning back meant abandoning the mission, and America needed this strike. At 8:20 a.m., with the Hornet pitching violently in rough seas, Doolittle's B-25 began its takeoff roll. The carrier was steaming into a 30-knot headwind, the bow rising and falling through 20-foot swells. Doolittle held the brakes as his right engines roared to full power, the propeller blast hammering across the deck. The deck officer's flag dropped. Doolittle released the brakes. The overloaded bomber accelerated slowly, wallowing as the deck pitched beneath it. Doolittle held the nose wheel down, building speed, watching the bow approach with terrifying speed. At the last possible moment, he pulled back on the yoke. The B-25 lifted off the deck and dropped toward the ocean as the carrier's bow fell away beneath it, then began climbing as Doolittle carefully managed the controls. He'd made it. Now 15 more bombers had to do the same. For the next hour, bombers launched at carefully timed intervals. Each takeoff was a death-defying feat of precision flying. Each pilot had to judge the deck motion perfectly, time the release to match the carrier's roll, and execute the rotation at exactly the right moment. One mistake meant death. Every aircraft made it off successfully. 15 bombers followed Doolittle's lead, each one clawing into the air with feet to spare, then forming up loosely for the flight to Japan. The engineering modifications had worked. The training had been sufficient. Now came the hard part, flying 700 miles over enemy waters to strike the most heavily defended targets in the Japanese Empire. Doolittle's bomber approached the Japanese coast at 50 feet above the water, low enough to avoid radar detection. The weather had deteriorated. Low clouds and rain squalls provided cover, but made navigation challenging. Doolittle relied on dead reckoning, compass headings, and careful time calculations to find Tokyo. At 12:15 p.m. local time, the Japanese coastline appeared through the haze. Doolittle climbed to 1,500 feet and turned toward Tokyo, following railroad tracks that led straight to the capital. Air raid sirens wailed across the city as spotters reported the approaching American bombers, but Japanese defenses were caught completely unprepared. Japan's air defense system had been designed to counter high-altitude bomber attacks approaching from the south, where American bases in the Philippines had been located before their capture. No one had anticipated low-altitude attacks from carriers approaching from the east. Fighter aircraft were scrambled, but most were configured for high-altitude interception and were caught out of position. Doolittle's bombardier released 4 500-pound bombs across a factory complex in northern Tokyo. The bombs struck with devastating accuracy. One bomb hit a tank farm, triggering a massive explosion and fire. Secondary explosions rippled through the facility as fuel storage tanks detonated in sequence. The 15 following bombers spread across Tokyo, Yokohama, and other targets, releasing their bombs from altitudes between 1,000 and 2,000 feet. The low-altitude bombing ensured accuracy far exceeding what high-altitude strategic bombing could achieve. Military arsenals, oil storage facilities, shipyards, and industrial plants took direct hits. The incendiary bombs worked exactly as Doolittle had designed them. On impact, they scattered thermite and magnesium clusters across wide areas, starting dozens of fires simultaneously. In Tokyo's densely packed wooden districts, these fires spread rapidly, overwhelming firefighting efforts. By mid-afternoon, smoke columns visible for 50 miles marked the burning targets. Japanese fighter pilots who managed to intercept the American bombers discovered that the B-25s were faster and more maneuverable than expected at low altitude. The twin 50-caliber machine guns in the top turrets proved deadly effective. Several Japanese fighters were shot down attempting attacks, and others broke off after encountering the intense defensive fire. All 16 bombers escaped Japanese airspace successfully, but now faced an even more daunting challenge: reaching China with insufficient fuel. The early launch had consumed an extra hour and a half of flight time, fuel that wouldn't be available for the journey to the designated landing fields. Doolittle's bomber and the others pressed westward across the East China Sea as fuel gauges dropped toward empty. The weather deteriorated further. Heavy rain and low clouds obscured landmarks. Radio navigation beacons that were supposed to guide them to Chinese airfields were silent, either not activated or destroyed by Japanese forces who had advanced farther than intelligence had reported. One by one, the bombers ran out of fuel. 15 crews bailed out over China or crash-landed along the coast. One bomber diverted to Vladivostok in Soviet Russia, where the crew was interned. Doolittle's crew bailed out near Kuzhou after their fuel was exhausted. All 5 crewmen survived the parachute jump and were rescued by Chinese civilians and nationalist forces. Of the 80 crew members who launched from the Hornet, 73 survived. 3 were captured and executed by Japanese forces. 8 were captured and imprisoned, with 4 surviving until war's end. The rest were rescued by Chinese forces and eventually returned to American control, though several were injured during bailouts or crash landings. The material damage inflicted on Japan was modest: 15 buildings destroyed, 90 buildings damaged, 50 fatalities among Japanese military and civilians. But the psychological and strategic impact was enormous. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Americans had struck back at Japan itself. The nation that had seemed invincible was suddenly vulnerable. American morale soared. Newspaper headlines screamed the news: Tokyo bombed. President Roosevelt, when asked where the bombers had come from, replied with a sly smile, "Shangri-La," the fictional paradise from the novel Lost Horizon. The Japanese reaction was shock and rage. The Imperial General Staff had assured Emperor Hirohito that Japan's homeland was invulnerable to attack. The Doolittle Raid shattered that illusion. Japanese military leadership faced intense pressure to prevent any repeat performance. The strategic consequences were profound. Japan immediately diverted 4 fighter groups from offensive operations to homeland defense. Fighters that had been planned for attacks on Australia and India were instead stationed around Japanese cities. Construction of new aircraft carriers, which would have threatened Allied shipping lanes, was delayed in favor of building more air defense fighters. Most significantly, the Japanese Navy became obsessed with eliminating the American carrier threat. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, accelerated plans for a decisive naval battle that would destroy the remaining American carriers. This obsession led directly to the Battle of Midway 6 weeks later, where Japanese overextension resulted in catastrophic defeat. 4 fleet carriers destroyed, the cream of Japanese naval aviation eliminated, and the strategic balance in the Pacific permanently shifted. The Doolittle Raid's engineering lessons influenced American bomber development for the rest of the war. The modifications that allowed carrier operations, additional fuel capacity, weight reduction, improved takeoff performance, became standard considerations for long-range bombing missions. The techniques developed for low-altitude precision strikes informed later tactical bombing campaigns throughout the Pacific Theater. Doolittle himself was promoted to brigadier general and awarded the Medal of Honor. He went on to command the 12th Air Force in North Africa, the 15th Air Force in Italy, and finally the 8th Air Force in England, overseeing the strategic bombing campaign against Germany. But he never forgot that April morning when 16 bombers did what aviation engineers had declared impossible. The B-25 Mitchell went on to become one of the war's most successful medium bombers. Over 10,000 were produced, serving in every theater of operation. They flew anti-submarine patrols over the Atlantic, supported ground forces in Italy and France, struck Japanese shipping throughout the Pacific, and conducted tactical bombing missions from the Aleutians to Australia. But none of those 10,000 B-25s ever faced the challenge that Doolittle's 16 aircraft overcame on April 18, 1942, launching from a carrier deck with insufficient runway, flying beyond their designed range, striking the enemy's capital with precision, then somehow making it to friendly territory despite impossible odds. The raid succeeded because one man, an engineer, test pilot, and combat leader, understood that impossible was just a design problem waiting for the right solution. Doolittle took a standard medium bomber and transformed it into a precision weapon system capable of carrier operations, long-range navigation, and accurate low-altitude bombing. The wooden broomstick gun barrels, the hand-pumped fuel tanks, the stripped-down interiors, the carefully calculated weight distributions, these weren't desperate improvisations. They were systematic engineering solutions to specific problems, each modification designed to squeeze additional performance from an aircraft operating at the absolute edge of its capabilities. When Lieutenant Ted Lawson's bomber, Ruptured Duck, crashed into the sea off the Chinese coast and he lost his leg in the wreckage, he had time before rescue to reflect on what they'd accomplished. Years later, he wrote, "We'd done something they said couldn't be done. We'd put Army bombers on Navy carriers, flown them into the teeth of Japanese defenses, struck targets that were supposed to be unreachable, and most of us made it out alive. That wasn't luck. That was engineering, training, and leadership, and mostly it was Colonel Doolittle refusing to accept that anything was impossible." 71 years after the raid in 2013, the last surviving Doolittle Raider, Staff Sergeant David Thatcher, stood before a crowd at the National Museum of the United States Air Force. He held one of the 80 silver goblets inscribed with the raiders' names, turned his goblet upside down in the traditional toast, and remembered the men who hadn't returned. "People ask what made the raid successful," Thatcher said. "They want to know if it was courage or surprise or determination. It was all those things, but mostly it was Colonel Doolittle. He figured out how to do what everybody else said was impossible. He turned the B-25 into a carrier bomber, a precision strike weapon, and a one-way delivery system for 16 loads of payback. We were just the guys lucky enough to fly them. The engineering genius that launched those bombers from the Hornet's deck represented something deeper than tactical innovation. It represented American industrial creativity, the ability to look at established limitations and ask, what if we changed the rules? That same thinking would design the B-29 Superfortress, develop the atomic bomb, create the P-51 Mustang's high-altitude fuel system, and ultimately produce the overwhelming technological superiority that decided the Pacific War. On April 18, 1942, 16 modified B-25 Mitchells lifted off a carrier deck and struck Tokyo. The Japanese military called it a terror raid, a desperate propaganda stunt that achieved nothing significant. But they knew better. They knew their homeland was no longer safe. They knew American engineering could overcome any obstacle. They knew that if stripped-down bombers could reach Tokyo from carriers, then what would happen when America's full industrial might was unleashed? The Doolittle Raid answered that question before it was even asked. The city-bombing monster that shredded Tokyo's defenses wasn't just 16 aircraft, it was the proof that American innovation, determination, and engineering excellence could turn the impossible into the inevitable. And that terrified Japan more than all the bombs combined.